Welcome to this explainer. Right now, as we sit here in 2026, we're literally watching a devastating global conflict unfold. It's completely reshaping the Middle East and sending massive shockwaves right through the global economy. The United States and Iran are locked in this sprawling, multi-front war, and honestly, understanding the sheer scale of this crisis and figuring out how we might actually find a way out of it is absolutely crucial. So we're going to break down the origins, the massive global stakes involved, and the proposed solutions currently on the table, all by looking at the data and the historical context that got us to this point.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a clear roadmap today. First, the 2026 war begins. Second, a history of hostility. Third, the nuclear tipping point. Fourth, the Strait of Hormuz. And finally, pathways to peace.
Section 1. The 2026 war begins. The present crisis.
We are starting right in the thick of the action, because to really understand the deep history here, we first got to grasp the unprecedented reality of what's happening on the ground right now. Back in late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive military campaign against Iran. This came right on the heels of a severe crackdown on anti-government protests by the Iranian government. The U.S. initiated sweeping strikes aimed at utterly destroying Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, taking out its navy, and completely severing its support for proxy forces across the region.
To truly wrap your head around the gravity of this situation, you have to consider the sheer scale of the escalation. We're talking about the U.S. administration ordering the largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They deployed carrier strike groups, hundreds of aircraft, the whole shebang. We saw sweeping airstrikes on Iranian nuclear and military sites, and critically, the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And almost immediately, this conflict spilled over the borders. Hezbollah entered the fray, launching rockets into northern Israel and sparking a parallel war in Lebanon, while Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia got pulled into skirmishes with Iranian-backed forces. And the stated U.S. goals for this massive intervention? Preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, forcing regime change, and neutralizing the threat to global energy resources.
Section 2. A history of hostility.
So how exactly did we get to a regional war of this magnitude? Well, let's step back and see how this builds, because this conflict is basically the culmination of decades of deep-seated mistrust. The modern animosity really traces all the way back to 1953. That's when the CIA and Britain's MI6 orchestrated Operation Ajax, overthrowing Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mosaddeq, right after he nationalized the oil industry. That event restored the Shah to power, but man, it sowed incredible resentment. Fast forward to 1979, the Islamic Revolution overthrows the Shah, and Iranian revolutionaries take American diplomats hostage for over a year, famously branding the U.S. the Great Satan. That permanently severed diplomatic ties. Then, much more recently, between 2018 and 2020, we saw the total collapse of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, followed by a U.S. maximum pressure sanctions strategy and the U.S. assassination of Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani. Each one of these events acted like a falling domino, leading straight to the crisis we're in today.
And you know, this history isn't just a bunch of dusty facts. It's a living, breathing part of the current conflict. As historian Irvant Abrahamian notes regarding that 1953 coup, he says the coup left a deep imprint on the country, not only on its polity and economy, but also on its popular culture. That trauma profoundly altered how Iranians viewed the United States. It created an enduring legacy of hostility, one that Iranian leaders continuously invoke today to justify their resistance to Western influence.
Section 3. The nuclear tipping point.
Now, the immediate catalyst for the 2026 strikes was this severely compressed time frame right here. Back in July of 2024, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced something alarming. Iran's nuclear breakout time, meaning the time it takes to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, had shrunk from at least a year down to probably 1 or 2 weeks. That rapid acceleration meant Iran could potentially manufacture the material for a device faster than the international community could even detect it, let alone respond.
Which brings us to a huge, critical question. With the devastating global consequences of a regional conflict being so obvious to everyone, why did the U.S. administration opt for such severe military intervention? I mean, why risk a regional war that inevitably draws in Israel, Lebanon, and the Gulf states?
Well, breaking down the core U.S. policy perspective, Washington argues that allowing Iran to cross that nuclear threshold just poses an absolutely unacceptable risk to national security. Defense analysts point out that it isn't just about the weapon itself, it's about the nature of the regime holding it. The U.S. rationale is that having a nuclear deterrent would embolden an ideologically aggressive Iranian regime to pursue regional hegemony completely unchecked, and that, ultimately, risks a much wider, way more destructive sectarian war across the entire Middle East.
So from Washington's viewpoint, the pragmatics of prevention meant striking before Iran could present the world with a nuclear fait accompli.
Section 4. The Strait of Hormuz.
Now, what's really interesting about this part of the story is how a distant military conflict quickly turned into a kitchen table economic issue for the whole world. Before the 2026 war began, an estimated 20 to 21 million barrels of crude oil and other products passed through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Keep in mind, this waterway is just 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. But since the U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran kicked off and Iran effectively moved to close the strait, the International Energy Agency reports that this staggering flow of oil has slowed to a mere trickle, and that has caused a massive global fuel crisis.
When you break down the numbers, you start to see exactly who this hurts the most. This single waterway fuels the economic engines of Asia. In 2025, 76% of the oil passing through the strait was purchased by just 4 nations: India, China, South Korea, and Japan. Together, those 4 countries account for 30% of global GDP. So by choking off the Strait of Hormuz, Iran hasn't just impacted the U.S. or its Middle Eastern neighbors, it has dealt itself a very potent trump card, essentially holding a massive chunk of the global economy hostage.
But it actually gets even more complex than that. When we think of the Gulf, we naturally think of oil and gas. But strip away petroleum entirely, and a startling picture emerges. According to data from the Kiel Institute, 6 nations reliant on this choke point export a combined $773 billion in non-mineral global trade. Across the top 50 non-mineral products, the Gulf represents an average share of nearly 15%. So, the strait isn't just about energy, it's a vital artery for hundreds of billions of dollars in everyday global trade, making it a critical pressure point with impacts that reach far, far beyond just gas prices.
Section 5. Pathways to Peace.
So with the global economy reeling and the Middle East completely engulfed in violence, diplomats are frantically scrambling for an exit strategy. In late April 2026, Tehran actually offered a new phased peace proposal to the United States. Step 1 of this proposal is an immediate cessation of the war and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, though, as you'd expect, Iran would continue to charge shipping fees. But here's the catch. Step 2 demands that negotiations regarding Iran's nuclear program be completely postponed for the time being. Essentially, Tehran is offering to ease the immediate economic shock, but only if the West agrees to freeze the exact nuclear debate that started this whole war in the first place.
So now, everyone is weighing these 2 vastly different policy options. On one side, some defense analysts argue that accepting this phased deal is actually the best option, because reopening the strait and ending the active war is just paramount to saving the global economy, even if it means kicking the can down the road on nuclear talks. On the flip side, continuing military containment is the path the U.S. administration seems to favor. U.S. officials, including the Secretary of State, have firmly stated they will absolutely not allow Iran to control and levy tolls on the Strait of Hormuz. They argue that backing down now, without getting any nuclear concessions, simply guarantees a stronger nuclear-armed Iran in the future.
Which leaves us with this final, lingering question. Can a permanent accord ever be reached? As we've seen throughout this explainer, with decades of deep-rooted hostility, a severely compressed nuclear breakout time, and the global economy basically held hostage in a 21-mile strait, a lot of experts believe U.S. policy is at a strategic dead end. Is there any combination of military pressure or diplomatic incentives that can actually satisfy both sides? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a permanent fracture in global geopolitics? It's an incredibly complex, volatile situation, and it's one we will all definitely be watching closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.